So my name is Lorelei McCollum. I work at IBM. I've been there for 10.5 years. I've been fully focused on automation, test, build, pipeline for most of my years there at IBM. So today what we're going to cover is getting groovy with Jenkins. So we're going to go over some fun groovy snippets of code that, yes? Oh, yes, I'll try and speak. Is that better? Great, sorry. So today we're going to cover some fun groovy snippets of code that essentially you can build into your pipelines, into your Jenkins jobs, and hopefully enhance what you guys have today in your businesses, your products, and what you do with Jenkins. So there's one disclaimer. I am going to show a lot of snippets of code. Now, the code snippets, if you just put them in and try and run them, they may or may not run because you're going to need some things like imports, and I do a lot of ... because I don't want to show a huge piece of code on the screen for you. So if you find you're trying to use this post-conference and you have problems with it, feel free to shoot me an email so I can assist. But I just wanted to throw that out there for everyone. So what is Groovy? So you've probably heard it throughout the conference. So essentially Groovy is the language that you can use in the Jenkins JVM, and you can run Groovy scripts. It's like a scripting language, essentially to do what you're looking to do in your Jenkins jobs. So you can leverage this in different parts of your Jenkins job, in both the build step and the post-build step. You can also do some administration type jobs with Groovy, which is kind of fun. So if you have a lot of slave nodes, or you have to do maintenance on your slave nodes, or just various administrative type jobs, almost like automating the operations of your Jenkins environment. So I've done some fun stuff with Groovy, which we'll see there as well. You can also pull your Groovy scripts from source. So we've heard a lot about source in this, storing your artifacts, your scripts, the pieces of your pipeline in source control. And this is crucial, I find, especially as you're making changes to these Groovy scripts, and you add one little line and it breaks the whole pipeline. So you really want to be able to track that and have that in version control. So I'll show you kind of my way of doing this, which I think might be a little different than the way other people have presented it, but it seems to work pretty well for us. We'll also do some fun Quicklinks on your build pages that you have for your pipelines. So for every Jenkins job that you run, you end up with like a build page at the end, which is your build report. Kind of tells you what went on, what happened, what passed, what failed. Various plugins out there today will allow you to kind of add things to that and kind of customize it. But with some of this Groovy stuff that I'm doing here can kind of take that to the next level and really give your developers that easy button that they're looking for, because they don't want to have to click 10 times to get to the logs for something that they need to debug. So we'll talk about that. I'll also go into some depth on the Jenkins Workspace and how you kind of use that to kind of get what you're looking to do, and maybe some administration type jobs with Groovy. And then lastly, the Groovy Label Assignment plugin, which is kind of one of my favorite plugins that allows you to kind of, based on parameters in your Jenkins job, switch which node, which slave node essentially the job goes to. So that's kind of a fun little plugin as well. So Groovy essentially is the language for the virtual machine. I kind of took this from the Jenkins documentation just to show you guys. There's two types of Groovy scripts in Jenkins. There's the system Groovy script and the regular Groovy script. The regular Groovy script is just like writing a shell script or writing a batch script. Just you want to do something quick. That's part of your build step in your Jenkins job, and it works. However, the system Groovy script is a little bit more, gives you a little bit more, because you essentially have access to the Jenkins API as this script is running in the Jenkins JVM as part of your build job. Now this can be dangerous. You can do things like system.exit in a system Groovy script, and that will take down your Jenkins master. I've had a developer do that, and we got a chuckle out of it. So there is some danger associated with system Groovy scripts. So you definitely want to have a full test and deploy sort of process for making changes to this type of stuff. And you can also facilitate that with Jenkins as well. So how do you use Groovy in your Jenkins job? So you have to install the Groovy plugin. I believe that's the exact terms that it's called. And when you do so, it'll essentially add to your Jenkins jobs a build step. It'll also add if you install the Groovy Postbuild plugin, so there's two plugins here, that will actually add to your Postbuild. So this is how you actually get the ability to use Groovy in your Jenkins jobs. And with the Groovy plugin, that gives you the ability to run a Groovy script or a system Groovy script. The Postbuild Groovy plugin gives you just the Postbuild option, and in that is essentially a little, a text file that you can essentially put your Groovy code in. And when that runs, it's actually running in the master space. So while you think that the Jenkins job, you've signed it to this node that you're on, the slave node, it's running there. When it actually executes that snippet of code in the Postbuild plugin area, it's actually running in the master space. So if you've tried it out before and you're trying to access files in the workspace and you can't get at them or you can't write files to the workspace, it's because it's actually running on the master. So you have to do some crazy remote channel stuff that could take you a long time to figure out if you weren't aware of that. So where to store these scripts? You can put them right in your Jenkins jobs, but the minute you do that and then you create another Jenkins job and you copy it, then you have 2 copies of it. So you end up with 2 places to make your change. So I always like to say put it in source. If it's a script, if it's more than 1 line of code, put it in source control. Doesn't matter what source control you use, put your scripts there. So what I have for me is I have a pipeline config project. It's in Rational Team Concert, which is one of IBM's source control. I'm going to be moving it to GitHub soon, but it's still in RTC. So you'll see some pictures in a minute that will kind of show how we essentially create a Jenkins job to build this project. So you have a new source component that you create, and you put all of these types of scripts in it. So whether it's a shell script, a build script, whatever it is, put them in source so they're versioned. So this is how I set up to essentially get these scripts into the Jenkins job at runtime. I create I have this job called admin update pipeline config. It's essentially a job that is linked to my source control repository, and essentially I have it configured to do the SCM poll when there's new changes, and it's polling on source control changes. And then with that, essentially when that runs, it just copies all those files down to the workspace. I don't need to build them. They're not a build. I'm not building a jar file or any type of actual build. I just copy them to the workspace and then I archive them. So there's this nice feature with the Postbuild in your Jenkins jobs that allows you to archive your artifacts. And with that, you now have a Jenkins job that runs when you make changes to your operations, your scripts, the things that support the pipeline, and it builds them in Jenkins, and they're all saved as artifacts. So then what you get is, in all these jobs, you can essentially copy artifacts from an existing job into that job and use them. So we'll see that later. But that's kind of this admin pipeline config job, that's how I set that up. So essentially, once you have these artifacts in source, and you can pull them from source, essentially with this Jenkins job, and you copy them into the workspace of the running Jenkins build, you can then reference them. So if you use the build step to execute a system Groovy script or a regular Groovy script, you can see here I just reference workspace and then the script name. So essentially these are the steps that you could leverage Groovy with in your build portion of your job. If you want to use the Postbuild plugin, which is in the Postbuild section, you can essentially, if you add that to your Jenkins job, you'll get a little text box as you see here, and you can put your Groovy script right in there. And what I have here is essentially I'm evaluating a file, and that file is referenced from that master project that builds the source. So it makes it easier than having to put that script directly in there, because then if you want to make changes to it, you actually have to go and update the Jenkins config and update the script there. So by doing this evaluate file, it allows you to have the scripts in source and be pulled from source when you're running this. There's also the email ext plugin, which gives you the ability to send emails in the post build of your Jenkins job. And that gives you, there's like an advanced button that if you click that, there's a pre-send script, which understands Groovy code as well. And in there is another snippet where you could put code directly in there, or you could actually reference it from a file that's in that project that builds from source. So this kind of gives you the ability to pull these Groovy scripts from source and execute them from source rather than having them, putting the code directly in your Jenkins job, which you can be burnt by that if something changes, or you make a change, or someone else accidentally changes it, and you don't have that version, that history, that tracking. So some fun with Groovy. So I'm going to show some snippets on the next couple of slides, and essentially I've left out all the imports. So with system Groovy scripts, you need to have the imports, or else they don't run. So these are an example of the various imports. Now, all these snippets don't need all of these imports, but this is just an example of the various imports that I require in each of these snippets to actually have them compile and run in my Jenkins jobs. So this is just a kind of a snapshot, as they will not be in the next slides. So the first thing that I found, that when I started customizing my build pipelines and writing jobs to, the developer wants this link on the build page after the build runs, because they don't want to dive into some console log to find it. So the first thing I found was the environment variables. So in a Jenkins job, you have various environment variables out of the box. You get a bunch of build number, build URL, build name. I think if you have the build user environment plugin, you get like the person that submitted it. You also get the parameters. If your build is a parameterized build, you get those parameters come in as environment variables as well. You can inject environment variables in the pre-build section. So there's lots of environment variables, and they get into your build, whether you added them or they're the defaults. And so you want to reference them, because they're there for a reason, and maybe you want to have a pretty display with it all at the end, or you want to send an email, and you want the email to include it all. So you need to be able to get these environment variables in these Groovy scripts in order to really do much, especially the workspace one, because if you have artifacts or files that are written to the workspace, you want to be able to get them in your Groovy scripts. So there's a couple various ways to get them, and it bothers me that they're quite different depending on what you're doing. And it took a little while to kind of figure that all out and iron it all out. So I have it kind of broken down here. In your system Groovy scripts, in the regular Groovy script with the regular Groovy script plugin, that's part of the build step. You essentially have to create, you create a little hash map, and you basically ask the thread, the current thread, which is that build that's building, to get its build variables. And that will essentially put them in that map so that you can then reference them from that. And you can get them out with either the config.get and the parameter name. You can also do something more complex with the build.theparent, which is the parent of that build. And then essentially you're saying the first build. So you can do some complex stuff. There's two examples here. Essentially to get out environment variables. But this is in the Groovy and the system Groovy scripts. This is kind of how you go about it with the syntax. You can also reference it with the build.environment_vars.the build name. However, if you have spaces in your parameters, because they came in as parameters you put spaces in them, I'm not quite sure if that really works. So it's best to do the create the map and then put the environment variables in that if you're going the route of the system Groovy script or the regular Groovy script. If you're using the Groovy Postbuild plugin, there's a different way to access the variables. So with the Groovy Postbuild plugin, if you click the little help symbol, which most plugins have if you haven't seen it, sometimes it's really helpful. And if the people who wrote the plugin did a good job with it, it can really help you get on your way. So with the Postbuild plugin, if you click the little help, it'll tell you that there's 3 variables that you can reference directly in that script that are already set up. So one of them is manager. And manager, essentially, you can get your environment variables off the manager object. So you don't have to define manager because the Groovy Postbuild plugin already defines it for you. They also have listener, which will allow you to write out to the console log, so you don't have to define that either. So you can read the help on the Groovy Postbuild plugin to find that out. The email ext in the pre-send script also gives you the build variable. So you can do build.environment variables and then do in this case, mail1 build result is an environment variable for that job. The other fun thing with Jenkins is that there is an environment variables on the actions navigation bar for if you're in the view of that build that just ran, you can see the environment variables on the left-hand page. However, that is not all your environment variables, which I really wish it was, but it's not. So if you add into the build step a shell script and just put env in it to print out the environment variables, it will show you like 100 more. And those ones are actually pretty useful, especially if you want to customize an email. If, say, you have a job that has 100 downstream jobs it triggers, and you want to send an email when the parent finishes that says the status of all 100 that it triggers, you can actually, those are all environment variables. So those downstream jobs that get triggered, in that parent job, you will have the downstream job's number and its result. So you can kind of do some fun stuff with that. But the environment variables link on the main build page for that build doesn't have everything. So you definitely need to add that shell script to see what you have available to that build. So now that we've got our environment variables, we can kind of use that in some of these quick links and this administrative type stuff. So we're going to go over some administrative jobs first. Since I'm kind of in charge of our Jenkins system, I don't like to do anything manually. So in terms of putting operating system patches on my slave nodes or doing hygienic restarts of them once a week, I'm not doing this manually. So I've essentially automated it all with Jenkins. And I have like this admin tab, this admin folder where I put all these jobs in there that essentially if my engineers ever do something manually, we put it in the list of the plan and we try and automate it with Jenkins. So we're going to cover a couple things here, essentially polling the status of your Jenkins nodes. This can be useful if you want to reboot one, but you don't want to reboot it while it has jobs running. Restarting the Jenkins nodes, toggling the node online or offline, pinning the build. So if you haven't seen this feature, essentially, if you have a Jenkins job that runs by default, if you haven't set up any discard old build history, I think it only keeps it keeps a small subset of that build history. There are plugins that you can essentially say keep 30 builds or keep the last 30 days worth of builds. However, what we found is we forget. There's one build in there, it's our release build, it's our release candidate, and we missed it. Like this has happened. We've lost our artifacts to that build, and that's devastating because you can't get it back. So the pin the build is a Jenkins job that we wrote to essentially when we're deploying to production, it will automatically go and pin the jars for the actual product build so that we don't ever lose them in Jenkins. And so in the Jenkins UI, you can manually do this. There's a little button. If you're on that build, you'll see in the top right-hand corner, it says pin this build or keep this build forever. And you click that, it won't delete it. So it'll always forever remain in your build history. So we've kind of automated this cool little job that will actually go and pin the build you want forever. You can also create Jenkins nodes on the fly, and you can delete them. So polling the status of Jenkins nodes. So you can create a fun little function called poll jobs in Groovy, and then essentially, because you're in a JVM, this is a system Groovy script, you can get the busy executors, the number of things running on that job, and essentially return that. So then you can have something that goes in and waits until there's no more jobs running. So you could have a nice complex script that essentially gets the list of all the slaves in your Jenkins system, asks, well, is this one got jobs running on it? If not, reboot it. And kind of have it on a schedule that runs, because we like to reboot the nodes once a week, essentially. We just find that sometimes, whatever it's doing, you get runaway threads and things like that. So it's just good to clean them up when you can clean them up. So we do that. And then there's, another thing here is online. So, when that reboot comes back, depending on how you've configured that slave, if it's Linux, usually it reconnects via SSH pretty easily. Windows, not so much. So you can basically in your script say, well, is it online again? If it's not, then you could potentially say, run a batch script to make it online. So this is kind of the power of these Groovy scripts, essentially. Here's an example of a restart function. So to restart your node, if you wanted to get this all automatic, and that's what we've done essentially is, it goes and it asks all these things, and then it reboots the nodes and then brings them back online and toggles them online. So this is pretty useful in the administrative area of your Jenkins system. So this also goes with the toggling a node offline and online. Essentially, in a lot of this stuff, you can kind of Google it. There's some Stack Overflow, and I wanted to share these snippets because it took me a while to kind of iron them out and figure them out, and that's why I wanted to share them. There's not too much in terms of documentation, but there is the Jenkins API. So if you do Google the Jenkins API, you can kind of see a lot of this stuff on like the computer and the slave and the Jenkins project and an abstract build and all that sort of stuff. So you can see the functions that are available, and then you can actually Google the exact function name to see use cases of it. That's kind of how I've come to these snippets. But this essentially is a way to toggle that node. So before in my hygienic reboot of my Jenkins nodes, what I do is I first toggle it offline, and then no new builds can go to it, and then we wait for the jobs to go to 0. Once the jobs are 0, then we call the restart function. Once the restart comes back, then we say, is it online yet? And then we wait. Is it online yet? And then we wait. Once it's online, then we go our merry way, and it goes into the queue for the next 7 days. So you can do some fun stuff with this. The pinning the build. So we talked about this before. Essentially, I have 3 little functions here that essentially will go and get all the jobs, get the exact build job, and get the build job that you want to mark. And this is kind of the code these are the functions that you would use to essentially pin a specific build. And the Jenkins job that we wrote that runs this will take in parameters of the job name, so the job project name of the Jenkins job you're actually looking to pin, and then the build number. So that would get passed to this. This is the parent script that calls those helper functions. So essentially it gets the environment variables of the job, so it gets the job name and the build number, and then essentially it gets the build to run to mark, and then it will keep log true. And keep log true is in the Jenkins API, and that's essentially when you go as a user and click that little button that says keep this build forever, that's what's getting executed on the back end. So you kind of can simulate, this is something that was manual, it's pretty simple, but we'd forget to do it. And so now we just kind of hooked it up to automatically do it for us. Creating a node. So here's a way to automate creating a node. So essentially for Windows, you have this secret code that you need to get in order to start the slave up and have it connect to Jenkins. So that's a little function. To get that, I have a couple parameters based on what I want to call it, what I want to label it, and what the operating system is, things like that. And note, the machine is already existing out there. This is not creating a virtual machine. This is just, hey, I have a machine out there, I want to connect it to Jenkins. So this is dynamically connecting it to Jenkins when you run. And deleting a node as well. So you can, if you don't want it to be part of your Jenkins system anymore, or you find it's constantly having problems, or you have something running that's monitoring and it's just always crashing or running out of memory, you could delete it from Jenkins, put it somewhere to be looked at and fixed or recreated. So that was some administrative type snippets of Ruby code that we use for various those types of jobs. Now we're going to talk about some fun ways of customizing your build pages for your jobs, for your Jenkins build. So we'll talk about emails, Quicklinks, setting the job display, setting the description, and essentially parsing sub-job results and creating cool tables with analysis on your build page. So this is what I mean by those things, if you're not familiar with it. So the job name is essentially, this is an example of a build page, what it might look like. It may look a little different for you based on what your build does. But for us, we have a bunch of build artifacts. We run some JUnit tests, so we have test results. So essentially, you can set the build the job name, so you can dynamically change that with Groovy. You can dynamically add to or enhance the job description. You can also add, we added a little table with data that we parsed from the downstream jobs and put it up on the parent. And then you can also add quick links. And the quick links are my favorite because that gives the developers a one-click button to get to what they need. So that was one thing I think in the session a little while ago was like ask the developers what they want. It's true. It really helps. They think you're really trying to make things better for them, and then you get these fun things, and then they actually look at the test results when it builds for their build. So it's a win-win. So the emails. So you can do some things in the email ext plugin, which in the Postbuild can run Groovy. And that can essentially look at the job that just ran and then pull information out of that job and add it to an email. So what I usually do is I have a parent job that runs 3 downstream jobs, and that job is an environment variable, the result of that job. So essentially mail A1, mail 1, mail 2, and mail 3 are sub-jobs of my parent acceptance, and they all ran downstream. So essentially in the acceptance, when it's done running, I want to go and get the results, create a list of all the failures, because I'm using the JUnit plugin to do the failures, and create this email essentially. So I change the subject based on whether or not the unit test passed or failed. I put the total failed. So I try to make the subject pretty concise since people are looking at this on mobile devices. But you can customize this. You can do whatever it is that you need to enhance your pipeline. You can get the list of actual test cases that failed. This can be really useful. So if it's like all login test cases or something like that, you'll see it. It'll show up in the email. And this is an example of, we also put quick links in our emails. So this is the other one click to get to the results. When you get an email in your inbox, I don't want to have to go to Jenkins and log in and then navigate to the build page, find the job that ran, find that quick link and click on it. Why not just give it to them in the email? So you can do this. You can add HTML to the email. It's pretty basic HTML, nothing fancy. But essentially it has a link to the results, to the URL, to those jobs that ran with the logs and everything on them. So you can really customize this in the emails. So this is the end part of the email ext, if you're writing directly, if you have a script executing in that section, where this is essentially setting the subject, adding those links for each one of those sub-jobs, and then essentially you set the contents to the body of the email with all that data. And all of this would go into a Groovy script, which you'd hopefully put in source and then reference in that pre-send script of the email ext plugin in your post-build. Now, this looks great. However, if you have 20 acceptance jobs that look just like that, and they all have different sub-job names, so maybe it's mail 4, mail 5, and mail 6, this script is hard-coded to those environment variables, which means that you now have to copy this script or make it parameterized or do something to allow the other 20 jobs to leverage this, because you don't want to just copy it because then you have multiple places to make changes, because if you make changes to one of them, the developers are bound to want the same fun things in the other one, so it's best to think about that. So what you can do is in the build section, so forget the email ext script, in the build section of your job, you can essentially, with Groovy system scripts, you can create the email. So with Groovy, because it's running in the Jenkins JVM, you can ask it, what downstream jobs did you trigger? And get a list of the names. And then you can essentially, because it's a known format, that those environment variables for the downstream jobs are created with build result and build number appended to them. That's just the standard convention for Jenkins. You can essentially dynamically create this email, and then this works for any of your acceptance jobs or any of the build jobs because you're not hard coding to those specific environment variables. And this is not the full script, but essentially shows you how, we're using multi-job plugins. So for that, you have to actually cast it to a multi-job Java or Jenkins API class, and then you can essentially, get the sub builds from it and kind of loop through and iterate through that. Now, if you weren't using the multi-job plugin, you will also notice, after you do this a few times, that when the environment variables for downstream triggered jobs for non-multi-job projects come in with triggered build in front of the job name. So the multi-job plugin, it's not standardized, and I'm not sure why it went that way, but the multi-job plugin, the subjobs come in with subjob name _build _number or _build _result. The regular freestyle project in Jenkins, the downstream jobs come in with triggered build number or triggered build result, and then the name of the job. So you got to play around with the environment variables based on the jobs that you have and however you set them up. But it is standard based on whichever way you went in your pipeline. But you can write this and kind of do this all dynamically, which is kind of fun. And then it's one place to make a change, and you don't have to update it in multiple places. So that's the email. So now we'll talk about quick links on your actual build page. So we saw back on that original slide how I had some browser console logs and a result viewer. So essentially this is in the Groovy Postbuild plugin. So the Groovy Postbuild plugin allows you to customize your build page. And here you can see I want to get the result of that subjob, and then I want to log a quick link. So I want to create that HTML link to the results on that build page, and so you can do all this in the Groovy Postbuild plugin. Now, one thing to note, if you have 20 jobs that you want to do this in, the similar thing applies. I have it hard-coded to that environment variable. And so in order to make a change to one, you have to make it to all of them. And so you have to have either passing that environment variable through to a Groovy script, or you're going to have multiple copies all over the place, and then it gets really confusing. So the same thing applies that we just talked about with the email, is you can do this dynamically as well. So this was kind of the biggest change that I recently made to all of our pipeline jobs, was to change them to essentially call a system Groovy script at the end of the build. And so every single one of them calls the same Groovy script, and it will create these fun quick links. And essentially we'll go and log them on that build page. And the way you do this is you do have to have the Groovy Postbuild plugin installed, but you can actually use the API, the Jenkins API of it, to add that build action. So you don't actually have to use the post-build step to do this. You can do it right at build time. So the Groovy Postbuild summary action is actually using that plugin's API to create that link to add and enhance to that build page, that HTML that you want to add. So that's doing it dynamically for the quick links and the emails. So now we'll talk about some easier stuff to customize that's really quick to do right away, is setting your job display name so you can change the name of the job on the fly with Groovy. So we like to change them to the parameters that are actually running, or the actual build number. We don't like the out of the box because it's really confusing to find what you're looking for, especially if the build is highly parameterized and you're really trying to get somewhere quick. You can also do this in the Groovy Postbuild as well. So it's basically the same thing to do it two different ways. And this also assumes that I've gotten the environment variables ahead of time, as we've seen on other slides. You can also set the job description. So that's the little blurb that's underneath the build. And what's really nice with that is that that shows up in the build history page. It's a concatenated version, but if you say someone reviewed it and you need to respin or something, you can add comments to it. So then you don't have to dive into the build page. You can just essentially read the build history and see all this text. So you can do this as well and we like to add the test result to the description. So it's a one quick look, and you can see, well, how many test cases passed, how many test cases failed, is this build good or not? So that's that way. So the Jenkins Workspace, so this can be leveraged and used I use it a lot in administrative type jobs. So Every Jenkins job that runs in its own workspace. If you're using concurrent jobs, you get a unique workspace for each one of those. I do recommend to delete the workspace before you start so that you don't have pre-existing artifacts lying around. But essentially you can use it, you can write to it. You can have the Jenkins build write files out to it, write its state, say, you know, I did this, so the next job that comes in can pick up where it left off. So we've kind of done with this slave maintenance, this hygienic rebooting of our nodes, I have the two jobs that are the worker jobs run out of the same custom workspace so that one writes files to it and then the other is, you know, it's on a cycle and it'll look to see if it has work to do. So I don't actually have, like, this node cycle is constantly running, but it's not a job that's blocking for a day. So it's a quick running job and it just writes out its work to the workspace, and then the other quick running job picks up its work and goes and does what it needs to do. So you can really use the workspace to kind of get around the jobs that are long running for this type of stuff. So the last thing here that I wanted to show is the Groovy label assignment plugin. So this is kind of fun. You have to install this plugin, but it gives you a checkbox to essentially, based on parameters of your Jenkins job, or, you know, based on if it's automatically triggered, send it to one node versus sending it to another. And this will trump whatever is set up in the restrict this project area. So this will trump that and send it to whatever you essentially specify here. Note if you have code here that doesn't compile, or it sends it to a node that doesn't exist, weird things happen. So your Jenkins job doesn't actually get submitted. It won't actually show, if you say build now or build with parameters, it doesn't actually show up in the queue. It's probably a bug somewhere, but as long as you make sure you have the right block of code in here, it can be pretty useful. So what we've done, you know, we make a lot of changes to our pipeline, and I want to ensure that it's properly tested before we actually use it for the real product builds. And so we have this parameter, this checkbox on every single one of our jobs that's essentially our regression test of that job. So it allows me to kind of run a whole regression test cycle of our production jobs by passing this true environment variable to everything and kind of test it out in a non-real scenario. So these are some of the useful plugins that we've covered in this presentation that you will need if you want to do any of this fun stuff. So the build name setter plugin that gives you the ability to set that build name. The Groovy plugin gives you the system Groovy scripts and the regular Groovy scripts. The label assignment plugin, as we saw, toggles which node you want to send it to. The Postbuild plugin allows you to customize that build page. The JUnit, XUnit give you the various test reporting results on basically what ran on that pipeline. And then the email ext plugin gives you that customized email at the end of your job and gives you the ability to run Groovy to create that customized email. And as always I say, you know, if you're stuck, Google it, because somebody out there probably has the same problem as you, as I've found. I've even gone on the Jenkins IRC chat, which I hadn't used IRC in a very long time, to ask questions and got really helpful answers there. So, you know, people are out there to assist, and I recommend reaching out to the community if you're stuck. Don't spend hours and hours on something because somebody else has probably done it or tried to do it and has some sort of solution for you. So with that, are there any questions?
Could you go back to the previous slide?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Your Groovy scripts fit around Jenkins and the plugins like a glove around a hand. What has been your experience in terms of stability from one release to the next? Does it break your code, or do your scripts keep going?
My scripts keep going. We are very, I guess, picky when we actually take our Jenkins updates because it is quite the ordeal to update Jenkins. I don't know if anyone's tried it, but it can take all day, especially specific plugins. So we have to schedule downtime to do that. But what I find is when you read the description on what updates are really coming in, that's key. And there's a couple plugins that will show if it's going to mess up your stuff, it says it in red, and you really have to read the fine print. Don't just take it because it could change things. So in that scenario, we usually go into more depth to figure out, well, do we really need this update? How is it going to impact us? Do we have the time to consume it in the downtime window? And we go like that too. But I haven't had any issues with the Groovy scripts based on, a few releases that we've been using them for.
The other question, I think you started out by saying, put your scripts in source code management and then have Groovy pull them out, and Jenkins will notice the change.
Yep.
Wouldn't a little change in one of your scripts and putting it into source code cause a flurry of 200 builds that depend on the script?
No, so what I do is I have one job that's essentially building that source project. Just like a build would build your product, and it's building my script repository. And essentially when changes come into that one job, like over here on the side, it just builds when there's new changes. All the other Jenkins jobs that need to use those scripts essentially copy artifacts, copy the specific file it needs, not all of them, because it doesn't need the whole pack. So it copies that one file down to its build at runtime. So the very first build step in almost all my builds is to copy artifacts from an existing, that project over here. So it's a little different than actually having that Jenkins job build that source, because what I find is our source control goes down and then our whole pipeline's blocked because we can't build. So we have this job that runs over here and builds while our source control system is available in case we have power outages, which we do. And so essentially these jobs are all copying the last successful build of this one. So if it goes down and we can't build, our whole pipeline can still keep going with the last checked-in successful release of those artifacts.
Excellent presentation.
Thanks. Yep, go ahead.
The question about these copying, that the job which copies there, so how that works on the slaves, because we do a lot of the stuff on the slaves and not on the master, so do we need one for each slave? Or?
So that job runs on the master. We don't run anything on our master. That's the only job, I think, that runs on our master. And the slaves can, so that's the nice thing about the copy artifacts from another project. Running a job running on a slave can copy artifacts from another job running on another slave. So there's no problems there with copy. Because it's an archived artifact in Jenkins, any other job on any other slave can access it.
Even the swarm slaves?
Even the what?
The swarm slaves?
The swarm, I'm not sure what you mean by swarm slaves.
There is a sort of a Java sort of a slave which we use to dynamically connect the slaves to the master.
I'm not sure we're using that. I'm not entirely sure what you're referencing, but all our slaves are Linux images that are connected via SSH keys to our Jenkins server, and we haven't had any problems copying artifacts from other jobs that run on other Jenkins slaves.
Okay.
Other questions? Yep.
So what would you say was the best resource that you had to learn how to do all of this?
Stack Overflow, probably. And then I was really stuck on the environment variables and how to do them, because you saw there's like 12 ways to get environment variables. And for that question, I went to the IRC channel. And it was like literally like a few minutes later I had it, and I was just like, wow, I spent so many hours on this. But it was great. It was great that I got my question answered.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? All right, I think we're done then. Thank you, everyone.